Part 2. Soul and Body. 1. It would be senseless for the author to try to convince the reader that his characters once actually lived. They were not born of a mother's womb. They were born of a stimulating phrase or two or from a basic situation. Tomasz was born of the saying, Einmal ist kein Mal. Teresa was born of the rumbling of a stomach. The first time she went to Tomasz's flat, her insides began to rumble, and no wonder. She had had nothing to eat since breakfast but a quick sandwich on the platform before boarding the train. She had concentrated on the daring journey ahead of her and forgotten about food. But when we ignore the body, we are more easily victimized by it. She felt terrible standing there in front of Tomasz, listening to her belly speak out. She felt like crying. Fortunately, after the first 10 seconds, Tomasz put his arms around her and made her forget her ventral voices. 2. Teresa was therefore born of a situation which brutally reveals the irreconcilable duality of body and soul, that fundamental human experience. A long time ago, man would listen in amazement to the sound of regular beats in his chest, never suspecting what they were. He was unable to identify himself with so alien and unfamiliar an object as the body. The body was a cage, and inside that cage was something which looked, listened, feared, thought, and marveled. Something that remainder left over after the body had been accounted for was the soul. Today, of course, the body is no longer unfamiliar. We know that the beating in our chest is the heart, and that the nose is the nozzle of a hose is taken out of the body to take oxygen to the lungs. The face is nothing but an instrument panel registering all the body mechanisms: digestion, sight, hearing, respirations, thought. Ever since man has learned to give each part of the body a name, the body has given him less trouble. He has also learned that the soul is nothing more than the gray matter of the brain in action. The old duality of body and soul has become shrouded in scientific terminology, and we can laugh at it as merely an obsolete prejudice. But just make someone who has fallen in love listen to his stomach rumble, and the unity of body and soul, that lyrical illusion of the age of science, instantly fades away. 3. Teresa tried to see herself through her body. That is why, from girlhood on, she would stand before the mirror so often. And because she was afraid her mother would catch her at it, every peek into the mirror had a tinge of secret vice. It was not vanity that drew her to the mirror. It was amazement at seeing her own eye. She forgot she was looking at the instrument panel of her body mechanisms. She thought she saw her soul shining through the features of her face. She forgot that the nose was merely the nozzle of a hose that took oxygen to the lungs. She saw it as the true expression of her nature. Staring at herself for long stretches of time, she was occasionally upset at the sight of her mother's features in her face. She would stare all the more doggedly at her image in an attempt to wish them away and keep only what was hers alone. Each time she succeeded was a time of intoxication. Her soul would rise up to the surface of her body like a crew charging up from the bowels of a ship, spreading out over the deck, waving at the sky and singing in jubilation. 4. She took after her mother, and not only physically. I sometimes have the feeling that her entire life was merely a continuation of her mother's, much as the course of a ball on the billiard table is merely the continuation of the player's arm movement. Where and when did it begin, the movement that later turned into Teresa's life? Perhaps at the time when Teresa's grandfather, a Prague businessman, began extolling the beauty of his daughter, Teresa's mother, for all to hear. When she was 3 or 4, he would tell her she was the image of Raphael's Madonna. Teresa's 4-year-old mother never forgot it. When, as an adolescent, she sat at her desk in school, she would not listen to the teachers. She would think about which paintings she was like. Then came the time for her to marry. She had 9 suitors. They all knelt round her in a circle. Standing in the middle like a princess, she did not know which one to choose. One was the handsomest, another the wittiest, the third was the richest, the fourth the most athletic, the fifth from the best family, the sixth recited verse, the seventh traveled widely, the eighth played the violin, and the ninth was the most manly. But they all knelt in the same way. They all had the same calluses on their knees. The reason she finally chose the ninth was not so much that he was the most manly of all as that when she whispered, "Be careful, very careful," to him during their love-making, he was purposely careless, and she had to marry him after failing to find a doctor willing to perform an abortion. And so Teresa was born. Numerous relatives gathered from all corners of the country to lean over the pram and talk baby talk. Teresa's mother talked no baby talk. She did not talk at all. She thought about the 8 other suitors, all of whom seemed better than the ninth. Like her daughter, Teresa's mother frequently looked in the mirror. One day she discovered wrinkles near her eyes and decided her marriage made no sense. At about that time, she met an unmanly man who had several charges of fraud on his record, not to mention 2 failed marriages. Now she hated those suitors with their calloused knees. She had a passionate desire to be the one to kneel for a change. She went down on her knees before her new swindler friend and left her husband and Teresa to fend for themselves. The most manly of men became the most downcast. He became so downcast that nothing meant anything to him anymore. He said openly what was on his mind, and the communist police, shocked by his rash statements, arrested him, brought him to trial, and sentenced him to a long term in prison. They closed up his flat and sent Teresa to stay with her mother. The most downcast of men died after a short spell behind bars, and Teresa and her mother went to live in a small town near the mountains with her mother's swindler. The swindler worked in an office, her mother in a shop. Her mother also gave birth to 3 more children. Then she looked in the mirror again and discovered she was old and ugly. 5. When she realized she had lost everything, she initiated a search for the culprit. Anyone would do. Her first husband, manly and unloved, who had failed to heed her whispered warning. Her second husband, unmanly and much loved, who had dragged her away from Prague to a small town and kept her in a state of permanent jealousy by going through one woman after another. But she was powerless against either. The only person who belonged to her and had no means of escape, the hostage who could do penance for all the culprits, was Teresa. Indeed, was she not the principal culprit determining her mother's fate? She, the absurd encounter of the sperm of the most manly of men and the egg of the most beautiful of women? Yes, it was in that fateful second, which was named Teresa, that the botched long-distance race, her mother's life, had begun. Teresa's mother never stopped reminding her that being a mother meant sacrificing everything. Her words had the ring of truth, backed as they were by the experience of a woman who had lost everything because of her child. Teresa would listen and believe that being a mother was the highest value in life, and that being a mother was a great sacrifice. If a mother was sacrifice personified, then a daughter was guilt, with no possibility of redress. 6. Of course, Teresa did not know the story of the night when her mother whispered, "Be careful," into the ear of her father. Her guilty conscience was as vague as original sin, but she did what she could to rid herself of it. Her mother took her out of school at the age of 15, and Teresa went to work as a waitress, handing over all her earnings. She was willing to do anything to gain her mother's love. She ran the household, took care of her siblings, and spent all day Sunday cleaning house and doing the family wash. It was a pity because she was the brightest in her class. She yearned for something higher, but in the small town there was nothing higher for her. Whenever she did the clothes, she kept a book next to the tub. As she turned the pages, the washing water dripped all over them. At home, there was no such thing as shame. Her mother marched about the flat in her underwear, sometimes braless, and sometimes, on summer days, stark naked. Her stepfather did not walk about naked, but he did go into the bathroom every time Teresa was in the bath. Once she locked herself in, and her mother was furious. "Who do you think you are, anyway? Do you think he's going to bite off a piece of your beauty?" This confrontation shows clearly that hatred for her daughter outweighed suspicion of her husband. Her daughter's guilt was infinite and included the husband's infidelities. Teresa's desire to be emancipated and insist on her rights, like the right to lock herself in the bathroom, was more objectionable to Teresa's mother than the possibility of her husband taking a prurient interest in Teresa. Once her mother decided to go naked in the winter when the lights were on. Teresa quickly ran to pull the curtain so that no one could see her from across the street. She heard her mother's laughter behind her. The following day, her mother had some friends over, a neighbor, a woman she worked with, a local school mistress, and 2 or 3 other women in the habit of getting together regularly. Teresa and the 16-year-old son of one of them came in at one point to say hello, and her mother immediately took advantage of their presence to tell how Teresa had tried to protect her mother's modesty. She laughed, and all the women laughed with her. Teresa can't reconcile herself to the idea that the human body pisses and farts, she said. Teresa turned bright red, but her mother would not stop. What's so terrible about that? And in answer to her own question, she broke wind loudly. All the women laughed again. 7. Teresa's mother blew her nose noisily, talked to people in public about her sex life, and enjoyed demonstrating her false teeth. She was remarkably skillful at loosening them with her tongue, and in the midst of a broad smile would cause the upper to drop down over the lowers in such a way as to give her face a sinister expression. Her behavior was but a single grand gesture, a casting off of youth and beauty. In the days when she had 9 suitors kneeling around her in a circle, she guarded her nakedness apprehensively, as though trying to express the value of her body in terms of the modesty she accorded it. Now she had not only lost that modesty, she had radically broken with it, ceremoniously using her new immodesty to draw a dividing line through her life and proclaim that youth and beauty were overrated and worthless. Teresa appears to me a continuation of the gesture by which her mother cast off her life as a young beauty, cast it far behind her. And if Teresa has a nervous way of moving, if her gestures lack a certain easy grace, we must not be surprised. Her mother's grand, wild, and self-destructive gesture has left an indelible imprint on her. 8. Teresa's mother demanded justice. She wanted to see the culprit penalized. That is why she insisted her daughter remain with her in the world of immodesty, where youth and beauty mean nothing, where the world is nothing but a vast concentration camp of bodies, one like the next, with souls invisible. Now we can better understand the meaning of Teresa's secret vice, her long looks and frequent glances in the mirror. It was a battle with her mother. It was a longing to be a body unlike other bodies, to find that the surface of her body reflected the crew of the soul charging up from below. It was not an easy task. Her soul, her sad, timid, self effacing soul, lay concealed in the depths of her bowels and was ashamed to show itself. So it was the day she first met Tomasz. Weaving its way through the drunks in the hotel restaurant, her body sagged under the weight of the beers on the tray, and her soul lay somewhere at the level of her stomach or pancreas. Then Tomasz called to her. That call meant a great deal because it came from someone who knew neither her mother nor the drunks with their daily stereotypical scarbarous remarks. His outsider status raised him above the rest. Something else raised him above the others as well. He had an open book on his table. No one had ever opened a book in that restaurant before. In Teresa's eyes, books were the emblems of a secret brotherhood, for she had but a single weapon against the world of crudities surrounding her, the books she took out of the municipal library, and above all, the novels. She had read any number of them, from Fielding to Thomas Mann. They not only offered the possibility of an imaginary escape from a life she found unsatisfying, they also had a meaning for her as physical objects. She loved to walk down the street with a book under her arm. It had the same significance for her as an elegant cane for the dandy a century ago. It differentiated her from others. Comparing the book to the elegant cane of the dandy is not absolutely precise. A dandy's cane did more than make him different. It made him modern and up to date. The book made Teresa different, but old fashioned. Of course, she was too young to see how old fashioned she looked to others. The young men walking by with transistor radios pressed to their ears seemed silly to her. It never occurred to her that they were modern. And so the man who called to her was simultaneously a stranger and a member of the secret brotherhood. He called to her in a kind voice, and Teresa felt her soul rushing up to the surface through her blood vessels and pores to show itself to him. 9. After Tomasz had returned to Prague from Zurich, he began to feel uneasy at the thought that his acquaintance with Teresa was the result of 6 improbable fortuities. But is not an event in fact more significant and noteworthy the greater the number of fortuities necessary to bring it about? Chance and chance alone has a message for us. Everything that occurs out of necessity, everything expected, repeated day in, day out, is mute. Only chance can speak to us. We read its message much as gypsies read the images made by coffee grounds at the bottom of a cup. Tomasz appeared to Teresa in the hotel restaurant as chance in the absolute. There he sat, poring over an open book, when suddenly he raised his eyes to her, smiled, and said, "A cognac, please." At that moment, the radio happened to be playing music. On her way behind the counter to pour the cognac, Teresa turned the volume up. She recognized Beethoven. She had known his music from the time a string quartet from Prague had visited their town. Teresa, who, as we know, yearned for something higher, went to the concert. The hall was nearly empty. The only other people in the audience were the local pharmacist and his wife. And although the quartet of musicians on stage faced only a trio of spectators down below, they were kind enough not to cancel the concert and gave a private performance of the last 3 Beethoven quartets. Then the pharmacist invited the musicians to dinner and asked the girl in the audience to come along with them. From then on, Beethoven became an image of the world on the other side, the world she yearned for. Rounding the counter with Thomas's cognac, she tried to read Chance's message. How was it possible that at the very moment she was taking an order of a cognac to a stranger she found attractive, at that very moment she heard Beethoven? Necessity knows no magic formula. They are all left to chance. If love is to be unforgettable, fortuities must immediately start fluttering down to it like birds to Francis of Assisi's shoulders.